Welcome to Christian Virtual Fellowship. Christian Virtual Fellowship is a production of Allegiance to the King. Allegiance to the King is a church that meets online. Believers from 5 of the world's 7 continents meet for fellowship online with us. And we not only have teachings, but we have other kinds of online fellowships as well, where we could share each other's lives, pray for one another, have that moral support that we so badly need, as well as spiritual support as well. So if you believe in the one true God and in Jesus, his human Messiah, and if you don't have a home church, join us. You can find us at a2kchurch.org and also on Facebook. We have online fellowships on Wednesday and Sunday, and other days in small groups as well. So today we're going to take a look at David and covenant faithfulness. One of my favorite topics. In this teaching, and let's see, in this teaching, we will review how God is portrayed as faithful to his covenant with mankind. In a nutshell, God shows his righteousness of covenant faithfulness through David, a man after God's own heart. I will go to the example of David and Jonathan, who loved David. The two men entered into a covenant between their houses, and later, although Jonathan died, David honored that covenant by blessing his son. This historical example points to truths that relate to both the present and the future for those who believe God raised their Lord Jesus from the dead. It starts in 1 Samuel, and I will summarize much of what happened in 1 Samuel for the sake of time. So let's first review what a formal covenant in the ancient Near East was. The book, God's Kingdom Through God's Covenants, explains that there were 4 elements to a covenant in the Old Testament. 1, that a covenant does not necessarily begin or initiate a relationship. It can formalize in binding and legal terms an agreement between parties who have developed a relationship before the covenant was made. There is conventional language for initiating covenants that is standard in the Old Testament. The standard expression for initiating a covenant is to, quote, to cut a covenant, which is in the Hebrew, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, so forgive me, karet beret. Number 3, a covenant gives binding and legal status to a relationship by means of a formal and solemn ceremony that is public, not private. 4, covenant making involves a commitment or oath or promise, and frequently signs or witnesses. The parties solemnly swear to the agreement. In the ceremony, animals were slaughtered and sacrificed. Each animal was cut in 2 and the halves laid out facing it, hence the phrase to cut a covenant. Then the parties would walk between the halves of the dead animals. What is being expressed is this: each party is saying, if I fail to keep my obligation or my promise, may I be cut in 2 like this dead animal. Whether or not these formalities were done, a covenant can be understood as an agreement between the parties arising from their relationship, which either just started or already existed. As we shall read, Jonathan and David made covenants without these formalities, like going public in order not to enrage King Saul. So now that we have the term covenant defined, let's take a look at the relationship between David and Jonathan and put it in a historical context. First, some historical context. King Saul had rallied some men to fight the Philistines at Gilgal. He was ordered by the prophet Samuel to wait 7 days, and then Samuel would make offerings of sacrifice to God to ensure victory. After waiting 7 days, Saul decided that he was going to make the sacrifice offerings himself, although he was not a Levite, and Samuel said that he would do it. King Saul was itching to go to battle with or without Samuel. As soon as Saul made the offering, Samuel arrived and rebuked him. Saul failed to obey God by not being patient and being self-reliant. God revealed to his prophet Samuel that he had found a replacement for Saul as king. Above is how God described David, the shepherd boy, Samuel, in speaking to Saul. And it says, "But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." That's in 1 Samuel 13. After that incident, Jonathan, one of the sons of Saul, is introduced to us. He is a skillful warrior and talks to God, asking for wisdom in attacking the Philistines. In battle, Jonathan relies on God's instruction and is very heroic, forcing the Philistines to flee. King Saul makes a battlefield decision which turns around and humiliates him. That's 1 Samuel chapter 14. Then in chapter 15, then Saul disobeys God once more by sparing the Amalekite king, that's Agag, and some choice livestock instead of slaughtering everything and everybody as God has commanded. And again, Samuel tells him he is going to be replaced as king because of his disobedience. So in chapter 16, God selects David as Saul's replacement, and Samuel the prophet anoints David, who then receives Holy Spirit. Then, after rejecting King Saul's armor and sword, David kills Goliath. And now we've gone through those chapters in a very summary manner. So when David returned from killing the Philistine, which is Goliath, Abner, who was the general for King Saul, took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. Then Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite." He was a man from Bethlehem. It must have thrilled Jonathan to see the passion and determination of David facing off against Goliath. No one else, including David, had the nerve to stand up against Goliath. Jonathan appreciated and admired David so much that he cut a covenant, Karat Beret, with David. So let's continue to read in chapter 18. Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that Jonathan committed himself to David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. And Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant, Karat Beret, with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his military gear, including his sword, his bow, and his belt. So what were the terms of the covenant? It is revealed a bit later. We will get to it. As a side note, while fighting while by fighting Goliath, David rejected the king's sword and armor, later he accepts Jonathan's. And here's just a picture that I ran across, thought it would bless you, with, I believe, David on the right and Jonathan on the left. You know, firefighters, policemen, and soldiers, all who share real danger, know that kind of love that Jonathan had for David, and they have each other's back. Today, when a policeman is killed in the line of duty, all the surrounding police departments show up and swear to take care of the surviving spouse and children. That's the kind of love and covenant Jonathan and David shared. Going to 1 Samuel 18. Now it happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with other musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this lyric displeased him, and he said, They have given David credit for 10,000s, but to me they have given credit for only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David with suspicion from that day on. So this was the start of Saul's descent into madness. Samuel had already told him that God was going to give the kingdom to another who would be obedient to him. No doubt Saul wondered who that would be. A young shepherd boy who killed the giant? Now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand, as usual. And a spear was in Saul's hand. Then Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had left Saul. So Saul started his persecution of David. David had already been anointed king by Samuel, had gained national attention by killing Goliath, and the admiration and loyalty of the king's own son, Jonathan. In fact, Jonathan told David to hide, while Jonathan would try to reason with his father, Saul. Saul eventually agreed that David would not be put to death. So for a brief time, there was some peace between the two, but it didn't last long. Soon Saul again tried to kill David, who escaped to join Samuel the prophet. It was fear that motivated Saul, because the Lord was with David and had left Saul. So David fled Jerusalem. What follows is an interesting spiritual event that shows how God protected David. Here it is. So David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah, and he informed him of everything that Saul had done to him. And he said, and he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. Naioth is a word that means camps or huts. But it was reported to Saul, saying, Behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Then Saul sent messengers to take David. But when they saw the company of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing and presiding over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. When Saul was informed of this, he sent other messengers, but they also prophesied. So Saul sent messengers again the third time, yet they prophesied. Wow. So as I said, Naioth means camps or huts, which were just outside the town of Ramah. Each of the three times, a group of messengers showed up to basically arrest David. but they ended up prophesying after the Spirit came upon them. These instances seem to have been God's way of protecting David from being arrested. Then he, King Saul, went to Ramah himself and came as far as the large well that is in Sikhu. And he asked, "Where are Samuel and David?" And someone said, "Behold, they are at Naioth in Ramah." So he proceeded there to Naioth in Ramah, but the Spirit of God came upon him also, so that he went along prophesying continually until he came to Naioth in Ramah. He also stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay down naked all that day and all night. Therefore, they say, is Saul also among the prophets? So this spiritual activity is seen by some scholars as God protecting David from Saul. Saul's prophesying prevented him from killing or arresting David. The stripping off of clothes and laying down naked all that day and night seem to be signs of Saul's lack of self-control. The question at the end, is Saul also among the prophets, reminds us of a verse in 1 Samuel chapter 10, when years previously, after Samuel anointed Saul, he ran into a company of prophets and seemed to lose self-control. And I'll read it right here. I have it at the bottom of the page. It says, "And it came about when all who previously knew him saw that he was indeed prophesying with the prophets, that the people said to one another, 'What is this that has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?'" In any case, this spiritual event may have made David and Jonathan wonder if it had changed Saul's murderous heart. So Jonathan promised to, and let me get this down here. And Jonathan went to his father and spoke on David's behalf to convince him to stop persecuting David. Now David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life while David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horish. And Jonathan, Saul's son, sent out and went to David at Horish and encouraged him in God. He said to him, "Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be second in command to you. And Saul my father knows that as well." So the two of them made a covenant, Karat Beret, before the Lord. And David stayed at Horish while Jonathan went to his house. Note that this new covenant, Karat Beret, means to cut a covenant, which is to start a new one. This new agreement was that Jonathan would be second in command to David. He did not seek to be king himself, even though he was the heir apparent to Saul. His love for David was that big, very self-sacrificial. So there are two covenants, one of peace between the two houses, and then for their respective positions in the future. What follows is an example of David's real nature. He is in the wilderness of En-Gedi, in a cave with some of his men, hiding from Saul and his 3,000 men. Saul steps into that same cave to relieve himself, do a number 2, and David's men tell David to kill him now. Instead, David merely cuts a piece of Saul's robe off. Then after Saul leaves the cave, David confronts Saul with that piece of robe and tells him he has never meant to do him any harm and has not rebelled against him. He could have killed Saul, but didn't, for God had anointed Saul. In this confrontation, David asks Saul a question. David asks, "After whom has the king of Israel gone out? Whom are you pursuing?" A dead dog? A single flea? David compares himself to a harmless and pathetic dead dog. Let's remember that. Saul replies, though if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away unharmed? May the Lord therefore reward you with good in return for what you have done to me this day. Now behold, I know that you will certainly be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. So now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not eliminate my name from my father's household. And David swore an oath to Saul. Then Saul went to his home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So Saul acknowledged David would one day be king for his own self-control and honoring God. Saul asked the same thing that David had sworn to Jonathan, and that was to have peace with Jonathan's house and Saul's house after David ascends to the throne. But David wasn't trusting Saul too much. He maintained his stronghold while Saul went home to Jerusalem. Later, Saul is prodded by others into again chasing after David. His army neglects to maintain local security at night, so David is able to sneak into the camp and steal Saul's spear and water jug. When David wakes up Saul's army and criticizes them for not protecting their king, the Lord's anointed, Saul acknowledged that David is relying on God to make him king, the Lord's reward. Once again, Saul sees the error of his way, that David indeed will be king, and so Saul leaves to fight the Philistines. Years later, King Saul and his son Jonathan are killed by the Philistines in battle. So David takes the throne over Judah, and there is a civil war that breaks out between him and a surviving son of Saul named Ishbosheth. That war is described as long, but finally ends with David recognized as king over all Israel, not just Judah. And here's one artist's vision of David on the throne. With the death of Jonathan, who died with his father in battle, David is released from one covenant, making him second in command. But what of the covenant that David's house had with favoring the house of Saul or of Jonathan? We go back in time to when Jerusalem and the palace learned of the battlefield deaths of Saul and Jonathan. There is real panic there. Now, Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was disabled in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse picked him up and fled. But it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell and could no longer walk. And his name was Mephibosheth. So I have read somewhere that it was customary for a nurse at that time to carry a child on her shoulder or shoulders. If the nurse was doing that and then took a tumble falling on the boy, that might explain the severity of the injuries. That's just a possibility. The scriptures really don't go into any explanation other than what we just read. Years later, David wants to honor his friend Jonathan as he swore to. He's established in his kingdom. The kingdom is now his. So he recalls that covenant made that was between David's house and Jonathan's house. To kill the families of the king you replaced was a common practice in the ancient Near East. They didn't want any former heirs to the throne to rise up and cause a rebellion. So they would just massacre the families of the prior king. That was a common practice. So this covenant that both Jonathan and Saul had asked for was designed to prevent that and to instead make each house a blessing to one another. The servant Ziba was no doubt. So then let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 9 on the screen there, and it reads, Then David said, Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul, so that I could show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba, and they summoned him to David. And the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. Then the king said, Is there no one remaining of the house of Saul to whom I could show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, There is still a son of Jonathan, one who is disabled in both feet. So the king said to him, Well, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodabar. Then King David sent messengers who brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lodabar. So the servant Ziba was no doubt profiting from the chaos of the death of Saul and his sons, because he was like the chief butler of the estate. There's no mention of Ziba having offered Mephibosheth his rightful place as heir to Saul's house and wealth, but he knows better than to cross David. He quickly mentions that Mephibosheth is disabled in both feet. Maybe he is portraying Mephibosheth as a possible eyesore in the court of David, and useless, not worthy of the king's attention. David is not moved by that description. He wants to honor his covenant with Jonathan. He ignores the disability comment and that Mephibosheth lived in someone else's house as a refugee, probably afraid of being killed by whoever replaced his grandfather. So David sends men to Lodabar, and Mephibosheth is brought to Jerusalem. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, Here is your servant. Then David said to him, Do not be afraid, for I will assuredly show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table regularly. Well, Mephibosheth is rightly afraid because of the custom of a new king to kill all the potential heirs of the last king. But David says, Do not be afraid. Mephibosheth submits to David's authority. He says, Here is your servant. He did not flee. He showed up. David is kind enough to explain why he ordered this man before him. And that reason is restoration. And it's huge, making this disabled man very wealthy, to include the services of Ziba, by the way. All the lands Saul had gained as king were now his. But what really is so special is the acceptance of Mephibosheth to the king's table, where he could meet and talk to and get to know the king and the nobles of Israel. It is an elevation of one of society's most vulnerable citizens to a very high place of influence indeed. David did not discriminate against the man, but saw him as Jonathan's child. Again, he prostrated himself and said, What is your servant that you should be concerned about a dead dog like me? Then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, Everything that belonged to Saul and to all his house, I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson will have food to eat. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. So what was Mephibosheth's response? Do you remember how David came out of the cave and said that, asked Saul if he was a dead dog, a little flea? What is your servant, says Mephibosheth, that you should be concerned about a dead dog like me? Surely that must have touched David's heart. He knew what it was like to be on the run, afraid, living in a cave, being a political refugee. What about us? How do we feel about being favored by the Almighty Creator? I think of Psalm 8, and on the screen it reads, "What is man that you think of him, and a son of man that you are concerned about him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You have him rule over the works of your hands. You have put everything under his feet." So what were we before God had pulled us out of the fire? Were we like dead dogs? Well, we were dead in trespasses and sins, and we didn't even know it. In a way, we were just like Mephibosheth. Now, Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. See, I guess he did pretty good while after Saul and Jonathan had died, taking care of the farm and all that. Then Ziba said to the king, "In accordance with everything that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he ate at the king's table regularly, and he was disabled in his feet. Note Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Isn't that what we are called to? Psalm 23 comes to mind. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. So by the faithfulness of David to his covenant with Jonathan, Mephibosheth was lifted out of poverty and elevated to a rather esteemed place. Imagine sitting at the king's table, listening to all that was going on in Israel, meeting the mighty warriors of David's army and the high society. Quite a thrill, to be sure. So things were looking really good for Mephibosheth. But as in all politics, things change. Here's a painting of David fleeing his son Absalom, who is just entering the city of Jerusalem with his followers who conspired to overthrow David. David is accurately portrayed as walking barefoot. He left in such a panic. A series of events had thrown things into total chaos. David had children from different women. One half-brother, Amnon, raped a half-sister, Tamar, and 2 years later, her brother Absalom ordered the rapist killed. Then Absalom started having thoughts of becoming king himself, maybe because David had tolerated what had happened to Tamar. Absalom led a rebellion against his own father, King David. That caused David to panic and flee Jerusalem. He didn't have a horse or a donkey. He walked barefoot up the Mount of Olives with his followers. Well, let's read what happens. Now, when David had gone on a little beyond the summit of the Mount of Olives, behold, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a team, or a couple, of saddled donkeys, and on them were 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a jug of wine. And the king said to Ziba, "Why do you have these?" And Ziba said, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride, the bread and summer fruit are for the young men to eat, and the wine for whoever is weary in the wilderness to drink." Then the king said, "And where is your master's son?" And Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he is staying in Jerusalem. For he said, Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me." So the king said to Ziba, "Behold, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours." And Ziba said, "I prostrate myself. May I find favor in your sight, my lord the king." So in the moment, without even hearing from Mephibosheth, David gives to Ziba all that he had previously given to Mephibosheth. Then through some quirky events, Absalom is killed and the rebellion fizzles out. David is headed back to Jerusalem to retake the throne. On the way, he meets Mephibosheth. Then Mephibosheth, the grandson of Saul, came down to meet the king, but he had neither tended to his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes since the day the king departed, until the day he came home in peace. And it was when he had came from Jerusalem to meet the king, that the king said to him, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" So he said, "My lord the king, my servant betrayed me, for your servant said, I will saddle the donkey for myself so that I may ride on it and go with the king, since your servant cannot walk." So notice that Mephibosheth came down to meet the king. He didn't wait for David to arrive in Jerusalem. And look at his condition. His feet were not taken care of. His mustache wasn't trimmed. He wore the same clothes since the king departed. Basically, he had been in mourning, mourning the loss of his king. His appearance flies in the face of Ziba's claim that Mephibosheth was claiming the kingdom. He would have groomed himself like a king if he was betraying David. Also recall that Ziba gave David a team of donkeys. In the NRSV, it says that it's a couple of donkeys saddled. Maybe one was meant for the king and the other meant for Mephibosheth. But Ziba abandoned his master and went to the king to betray him. Mephibosheth continues on. Furthermore, he, that's Ziba, has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Therefore do what is right in your sight. For all my father's household was only people worthy of death to my lord the king. Yet you placed your servant among those who ate at your own table. So what right do I still have that I should complain any more to the king?" So the king said to him, "Why do you still speak of your affairs? I have decided. You and Ziba shall divide the land." And Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him even take it all. Let him even take it all, since my lord the king has come safely to his own house." So in an indirect way, by saying that all my father's household was worthy of death, and of course that wasn't true because Jonathan was of Saul's household, and Jonathan was a loyal friend of David. But he reminds the king of the covenant that he had with David, with Jonathan, that led to him giving Mephibosheth a place at his table. So by showing up with no doubt much effort, Mephibosheth seeks vindication from the slander of Ziba. So what does David do? He doesn't seem to make a really decisive ruling about Ziba being a liar and abandoning his master. Instead, he splits the baby. That would still leave Mephibosheth a very wealthy man. But he is not interested in riches. All Mephibosheth wants is to be with David, to be at the king's table and share in the victory of David returning to his throne. Doesn't that sound familiar to you? Don't we want to be with Jesus when he comes back and rejoice in his victory? Don't we just want to be with God in his kingdom? The last time Mephibosheth is mentioned is in 2 Samuel chapter 21. There had been a 3-year-long famine, and David inquired of the Lord what was causing it. The Lord said that there was blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he had put Gibeonites to death. Apparently, Saul had persecuted the Gibeonites despite a treaty that Israel had had with them. David asked the Gibeonites what they wanted so as to end the matter. They wanted blood revenge, but they weren't authorized to take matters into their own hands. They asked that 7 of Saul's descendants be offered up, and David agreed and did so, but spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. He was not offered up. So that is the last we hear of the son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth. So what have we learned from our reading today? I believe we have been blessed with a record of David and Jonathan as a typological example of God's and Christ's faithfulness. Now, what do I mean by typological? I refer to the book God's Kingdom Through God's Covenant. Typology is symbolism rooted in historical and textual realities. It involves an organic relation between persons, events, and institutions in one epoch or time and their counterparts in later epochs. The early person, event, or institution is called the, quote, type, while the later one is called the, quote, antitype. As an author of a book called Lentz reminded us, the typological relation is a central means by which particular epochal and textual horizons are linked to later horizons in redemptive revelation. It links the present to the future, and it retroactively links the present with the past. Second, typology is prophetic and predictive, and thus divinely given and intended. In other words, God intended for the type to point beyond itself to its fulfillment or antitype in the later epoch of redemptive history. Typology ought to be viewed as a subset of predictive prophecy, not in the sense of verbal predictions, but in the sense of predictions built on models, patterns that God Himself has established that become known gradually as later texts reinforce those patterns, with the goal of anticipating what comes later in Christ. In this way, typology is a more indirect kind of prophecy. In our reading about David and Jonathan, we see not only an historical record, but also signs of what are pointing to both the present and the future. God made David king of Israel because he was a man after God's own heart. In David, we have a, quote, type for God who wants to establish his kingdom. David in Israel, God on earth. As God practices patience and long suffering with mankind and his own people, like us, God tearfully suffered with Saul's madness, waiting for his kingdom to appear without any violence to force it. Even when he had the chance, he doesn't kill Saul, who sought his life. That showed just how much self-control and trust reliance he had on God. Once in power, he uses his authority to fulfill his covenant and elevates the humble Mephibosheth. David wasn't perfect in his obedience to God, which is why he failed to fulfill the messianic role. But his example points to Jesus, who succeeded in unfailing obedience. David relies on Jonathan for warning and on God to establish his kingdom. He promises his loyal friend Jonathan he will be second in command and that his family will be safe when he takes the throne. He restores the humble, disabled son of Jonathan and elevates him to his own table in his palace, giving not only riches but dignity. Has God not breathed life into those dead in trespasses and sin? People like us, certainly. And will he not fulfill his covenant with Abraham to bring us into his kingdom on earth and in heaven? Definitely. Has he not made us a nation of kings and priests to do his will? Yes. As I said earlier, David's faithfulness pointed to a man to come who did act faithfully, consistently, and always becoming worthy of exaltation to become God's second in command. And of course, I'm referring to Jesus Christ, our Lord. Jonathan is a type of Christ. He loved David even more than his own father or his own inheritance. Although prince, he honored David more than anyone else. He was courageous, loyal, and had covenants with God's man, David. David promised him the position of second in command, lower only than the king. Jonathan asked only for his family to be spared when David takes his throne. He listened to God as he bravely faced his country's enemies and had special insight into the intentions of his father Saul. David died in battle with his father and brothers. His death points to Jesus, who died fighting the forces of evil in this world. Now we are told to die to our own selfishness and live for God. So I'm going to offer some applications, which I think you could probably come up with a lot more, but here's just a couple. In reading the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, we can not only find great wisdom, but also situations which point to both the present and the future. The covenantal faithfulness of David reflects to us God's faithfulness to us now and in the future. He has declared us righteous now and will again in the future. When God returns as king, we are saved from his wrath and instead will enjoy the blessings of being with him and Jesus. Slaying the giants in our lives, loyalty, faithfulness, brotherly love, mercy towards our enemies, never go out of style. And they were parts of David's character. So by God's Spirit being alive in us, those characteristics are ours. As David's hope for his kingdom burned brightly in him, so let's keep our eye on the prize, sitting at King Jesus' table one day. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll stop sharing the screen. And let's see, we've gone on about 48 minutes. So, well, let's just let it continue to record. And I hope that was a blessing to you. And oh, I see Edgardo has joined us. Hi, Edgardo.
Hello, Ray.
Well, God bless you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm blessed. I'm blessed, Ray. Thank you. Wonderful message.
Oh, well, you're welcome. It was my pleasure to study it. You know, the person that gets the most out of these teachings are the teacher. And I learned so much. Greg, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just trying to get my video to come on here. There we go.
There you are.
Well, that is like one of my most favorite parts of the Bible is Book of Samuel, and I like how you presented that information, and yeah, I just love the Book of Samuel, and it's kind of hard to figure out sometimes because it's like somebody took all the papers and mixed them all up because it's not they're not necessarily presented in a chronological manner all the time, but very, very interesting stuff. It makes me think about, the way that David was so determined to keep this covenant. Um, it makes me think about God with his covenant with Abraham and his covenant with David, and how, when the Israelites were worshiping the golden calf, and he says to Moses, "Look, I'm just gonna wipe these people out and start all over with you, Moses." And
Yeah.
Moses is like, "No, no, don't do that, because what are people gonna say? They're gonna say, oh, you weren't able to do this or you weren't able to do that." And you have to remember your covenant. And that's what God does, is he remembers these promises, his promises to Abraham, his promises to David, because the kingdom of Judah after David and Solomon, and well, things just kept going downhill. Sure, there was a few good ones in there, but there was a lot of bad ones.
Yeah.
But yet he kept going until Jesus finally came and succeeded in being perfectly obedient. Um and it makes me think about, the scripture that says it's impossible for God to lie.
Hmm.
And and John Truett gave that talk a little while ago about lying or telling the truth, or there are some instances in the Bible where God is maybe being like a little bit deceitful or sneaky, like with King Ahab, when they, it shows that they're having that heavenly conference,
Oh, yeah.
and with
Mhm.
his counselors, his angelic counselors, and he's saying, "Well, what should we do with Ahab?" And one guy suggests, "Hey, well, we'll put a lying spirit into the mouth of his prophets." And
Yeah.
God says, "Okay, yeah, that's a good idea." So when I think of that scripture of like, it's impossible for God to lie, I think specifically it's talking about God's promises. It's impossible for him to break his promises, like his covenants.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
yeah, so I have more I could say, but I'll let somebody else talk.
Well, thank you for those comments. And God has his purposes, and he is all wise God. So if he's doing something, it must be the best, and he truly is faithful. And we have to hang in there sometimes when we don't really understand why things go the way they go. Suzanne.
Yeah, I just love Kingdom Through Covenant. Actually, I think the first iteration of that book was God's Kingdom Through God's Covenants, and then the second published Gentry's book, they changed the title to Kingdom Through Covenant just to shorten it, just because we shorten everything these days. It's a great, great book that everyone should read, and to view the whole Bible and the whole history of God's dealing with humanity as a series of covenants is really the best and most accurate way to do it. Not so much dispensations or Old Testament, New Testament. Like the Old Testament God was mean and smote everybody, but the New Testament God is Jesus and he's loving. It's like, wait, no, you're mixing this all up, getting it all wrong. So yeah, so I just want to mention that. The other thing is, like, the more we really get deep into David and his character, and we see how amazing it is that God favored David to the point where he promised to have the Messiah come through his line, have someone on his throne forever, eternity. He schemed to commit murder, and he committed adultery. He went against God's, will when he did the census. I mean, he did a lot of really bad things that we would consider would disqualify any person from God's favor, and certainly from God giving them like this huge blessing to have their lineage, go on forever and have the world be blessed through, his seed. So I think it just, it gives us a lot of thought about how merciful and gracious God is, how he sees the heart. I mean, David did some really bad things, and he had moments where his heart was really bad. But like even in Psalm 51, he pleads to God, put in me, created me a new heart, give me a new spirit. Like, he repented. He always had remorse. He always listened and was humble when Nathan came in and chastised him about his affair with Bathsheba, and when he punished him by having his child die. He repented. He felt remorse. I mean, it just shows that we're flawed. We have bad intentions. We have sin, but God looks at the heart and sees that there's something there that's really redeemable. And that should just give all of us encouragement, regardless of how low we've fallen or how, whatever horrible things we might have done or might still be doing to ourselves or to others. We should be encouraged that God is a compassionate, merciful God. He describes himself to Moses, the first adjective that he uses to say, I am a God that is compassionate. That is the number one first descriptor that God uses for himself. He doesn't say, I am the all-powerful Oz, I am great and powerful and, whatever. He says, I'm compassionate. Like, how amazing is that? So I think it's, this is a beautiful story about David's faithfulness, David's view of his covenant with God and his covenant with Jonathan and Jonathan's son. And yeah, it's just beautiful. We just have so much we can learn. So thanks for sharing that. I don't think we ever can get tired of having these lessons and these Bible stories brought to life. Thank you so much, Ray.
Yeah, I think of how even all that sin that David committed did not harden his heart, so that when he was confronted by Nathan, he immediately confessed. He didn't make rationalization. He made no excuses. He says, yeah, I'm the one. I did it. I'm wrong, and I'm sorry. And, that's a problem with practicing sin, is that it does harden people's hearts. Sin is very deceitful, and we are very vulnerable to that deceit. So it just showed that David, despite his sin, still had high regard for God and really didn't deceive himself, just wanted no one to know about it, I guess. Dan Gallagher.
Unmute. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ray. I really appreciate this teaching. I grew up in a faith tradition that never emphasized covenants, and the emphasis was on dispensations.
Yeah.
And when, as I reflect back, when the emphasis is on what they define as dispensations, the emphasis is on differences, disparities. And then the day came along when all of a sudden, through Kingdom Covenant, the book that you guys just had held up, and I read that, and all of a sudden my mind just got exploded on covenant. Yeah, God's kingdom through God's covenants, and the covenants emphasize the unity of God through time, and his continuation to honor those promises and what he's always seeking to bring. And so I just really appreciate it because, I've done teachings on covenants. I did a lot of times on research on it just to get my head wrapped around it. But to me, the most important thing is that we're ministers of the new covenant. And if you don't understand what covenant is and the old covenant, then it's very clear that we enter into a the new and everlasting covenant, the new covenant, the covenant with Christ, all of the implications of that. And one of the requirements of a covenant is remaining faithful to the terms of the covenant. So if you
Amen.
don't understand that, that's why I really appreciate this, because it's so fundamental to understanding holistically and in a very healthy way what it is we have and what we need to live up to. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, there's a single unified narrative in the Bible. And when people chop it into different parts, dispensations or administrations, then that unity and that narrative is compromised.
Exactly.
And I attend another fellowship as well on Monday nights with wonderful, sweet believers who believe in dispensations. And so whenever I have a chance to teach, I have on occasion taught about how the covenants are how we are to look at the Bible and how they're not separate little contracts between us and God, but instead it's all one continuum. And so from the Bible, from beginning to end, is one long story that affects us and that we are a part of, that we play a role in. And that dividing people up, say, and it leads to a lot of confusion too. And I listened to N.T. Wright talk about it, and he talks about how it's really unique to the United States, this fascination with dispensations, and that the rest of the world doesn't buy into it. They are more covenantal. And so I'm thankful for, learning about that. And in fact, I remember watching one of your videos, Dan, that was very instructive about the covenants. And that really, just cemented things that I was just starting to learn about.
Yeah, in the same way, Ray, it's in the same way how we look at the feasts of Israel. We don't see the feasts of Israel, how overall they point to the redemptive plan of God. I mean, they actually reveal God's plan of redemption. So we look to the feasts as, oh, well, those were old requirements under an old covenant.
Yeah.
And again, we're losing the continuity. So I really do think, and that's why I really appreciate what you taught on. Covenants is one of the most fundamental things that we as God's people have to understand what God has done, is doing, and is going to do, and how it unifies us all together.
And I'm going to give you the last word on that. I'm going to end the recording now. And for those of you who have stayed with us through this presentation and the comments, I want to invite you to Allegiance to the King and to join us. I'm very thankful that you have listened and have turned to Christian Virtual Fellowship, but we have much more to offer on a personal way, spiritually, in terms of learning about the Bible and learning more about our Father God. So anyway, with that, wherever you are, God bless you. And now I will end the recording.